Our last speaker of this session is Dr. Randy Bluffstone. Dr. Bluffstone is a professor of economics and director of the Institute for Economics and Environment at Portland State University. Dr. Bluffstone will speak on, can community forestry contribute to the SDGs, evidence from Nepal? Please.
Perfect. Okay, well, I was delighted to hear about the NSF DICES grant in Nepal, which is a place close to my heart. And I was especially glad to see that a number of collaborators on our work are also on this project. And I've highlighted them there, Naya Podella and Rajesh Bista, who you've heard from earlier. This work was supported by the World Bank. Well, of course, collective forests, I don't need to tell this group, are very important, making up a significant portion of the forest in lower income countries, and providing a variety of services, including collective services, as well as, of course, the direct use values, which we've heard about in other talks, fuel wood fodder, grazing, and the like. It's likely that forest evolution and local forest collective action can be a part of any welfare improvements, especially in rural areas, and huge literature on this contributed to by a number of people here on the role of communities. And also I'd like to highlight the experimental work, which has shown that a lot of this cooperation it's possible, that's the self-interested results that we used to rely on in prisoner dilemma type models don't seem to really hold in the lab. So the question then, at least one of the questions for me, is can this forest evolution, taking Nepal as a case study, can it support some of the sustainable development goals? And I wanted to look particularly at a few of these, in collaboration with that list of authors that I showed you. SDG number 10, reducing inequalities, 13, climate action, and 15, life on land, especially focusing on biodiversity, tree biodiversity in particular. And so we collected data in 23 and 13, spent some years analyzing this and focused on a few questions. The first was, does the Nepal Community Forestry Program, which you heard about this morning, does it sequester more or less carbon than the government forests? Do these Community Forestry Program forests have better or worse tree biodiversity compared with government forests? And are they more or less equitable and fair? So getting to that SDG number 10 in some way than the government forest communities. And then lastly, we'll see if I get to this, but are these CFP forests managed differently than government forests? Is there a different management that sort of underpins any results that we might be seeing? There's a rapidly expanding literature, but still relatively limited literature that rigorously tries to identify effects of local forest collective action. This is a introductory paper in a recent issue of World Development on decentralized forest management that I co-edited with Alan Blackman of the Inter-American Development Bank, which was actually overseen by Arun, who's here with us today. And so here's the summary of the results. What we find in this work is that carbon sequestration benefits come from the collective action, but it really appears to be vis-a-vis open access rather than the formal sort of codification of collective action under the Community Forestry Program. And a caveat here is we also are in the process of looking into the cost of this carbon sequestration, and we actually estimate that it could be rather expensive. So stay tuned on that, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. We find that these community forestry program forests have more biodiversity. So we might have considered the possibility that when forests are devolved to communities, that they would focus on commercially exploitable species, but we don't find that's the case. We find more tree biodiversity. We also find more equity and benefit sharing, speaking to SDG 10. And we do find that these results are underpinned by different and we think more effective collective forest management. And that's work in progress. So what we start with is a nationally representative sample of forests and communities in the community forestry program. And I'll show you a map in a second, matched with observationally equivalent government forest. So with the collaboration of especially Forest Action in Nepal, that's part of this DICES project, took 130 forests, 65 community forests, 65 forests outside the program, half in the hills, half in the Tarai, which is the lowland belt adjoining India. And then we sampled community forests to be observationally similar to those in the community forestry program. And then we also took a sample of 1,300 households across those 130 forests, 10 in each of the sampled communities. And so here's where the research sites are, and you see that they're really spread across the landscape of Nepal. This area here in the middle, this would be the Middle Hills. We don't sample from the mountains because there's not that much tree biomass up there. And then this is the Tarai area. There are many more community forestry program forests in the hills than in the Tarai. There's not that many in the Tarai. In terms of the data that we gathered, the social data, some data on the community level about the access rules of the community, transparency, conflict resolution, things like that. And then also at the household level, things on the caste, ethnicity, gender, perceptions of forest governance, and so forth. We did plot sampling in Nepal, 620 randomly selected plots, and on a variety of metrics, tree count, sizes, species, and so forth, including measuring carbon. And the trick here is the one of identification that many of you are very, very well familiar with. And essentially it involves, as we're looking at outcomes, comparing the community forest with government's forest, but trying to be careful to match like and like, and not match unlike forests. That's what our methods are trying to do. And so what we use panel data regression, where we have plots, and so that could help with that. And then where we don't have that, using propensity score matching. In the analysis I showed, using genetic matching with replacement based on the propensity scores combined with Mahalanobis distance, and then some sensitivity analysis on that to see if those results, how sensitive the results are to being upset. So first thing we found is that there's really significant forest, collective action outside of the formal community forestry program. A lot of evidence of that in our surveys, from identifying year formation, which is a metric we use, but other things as well, like written rules and clear boundaries, formal meetings, things like that. We take, in the first results I'm going to show you, we take, can the respondent identify the user group formation year as a measure of collective action? Like, when did this group start? And then a more comprehensive measure is identification of that formation year, or has this group actually been proposed to join the community forestry program? So those are two measures of forest collective action that are not actually joining the community forestry program. And so this work on SDG 13 on carbon sequestration came out in World Development, again, overseen by Arun, and two of the co-authors on this paper, also part of this DICES project, Rajesh and Naya. And so here's what we find. We find this is carbon per hectare by forest in tons. And what we find is actually that the non-community forestry forests have more carbon per hectare than the community forestry programs forest. But we need to be a little bit careful there because Tarai forests have so much, it's a more productive ecosystem. So there's really an important confounder there. And so Tarai forests have so much more carbon sequestered compared with the hill areas. And remember, hills are where the community forestry program forests are. So here's what we find. We try to adjust for environmental factors, including baseline NDVI, use community control. So this is analysis at the plot level, doesn't involve the household survey. And so here's what we find. We find that the community, we do get a positive estimated coefficient on community forestry program for community forestry program forests, but we don't find that that's significant at any reasonable level. But these other measures of forest collective action where the counterfactual is the open access, there we find significant effects. And these are economically significant. You'll remember that the average was in the 90 or so tons per hectare. And here these, this collective action seems to be adding, compared with those means, about a third. So really significant and much higher compared with open access forests. So key findings here, definitely that there's a lot of collective action outside the community forestry program in Nepal. I can't speak to other countries. And the effects seem to be empirically large compared with open access, which we found to be very interesting, that the forest didn't have to be part of this formal program to sequester more carbon. The other two SDGs I'm going to talk about are analyzed using genetic matching on these propensity scores, combined with the sensitivity analysis that I mentioned, using Rosenbaum bounds to see how sensitive these are. And on tree biodiversity, this paper was led by Hardy Luintel, formerly at Forest Action, received his PhD at Portland State University, now down in Texas. And this is a paper that came out in Forest Science in 2018. So a couple of measures of biodiversity used the total number of species, simple measure, the Shannon index, standard measure, as I understand it, of biodiversity. And the one that I'm going to focus on here is the effective number of species, which is a transformation of the Shannon index. Just note that there's a lot of variety in tree biodiversity. So let's focus on tree biodiversity across the sample, where that upper 25% of the plots has vastly more tree biodiversity than the bottom 25%. So some really big differences in the sample. And here's what we find. First of all, focusing on the overall sample, so all the forests together, and then broken down by different types of forest. Now it looks like I've got a window that's kind of popped up in there unexpectedly. So, but basically at the 95% level, we find that in the overall, we have a positive effect of the community forestry program on tree biodiversity. So there's overall across sample. And then down here, this is the Rosenbaum bounds. And there's some debate, it's no one number that's the appropriate cutoff, but 1.2 is often cited as a pretty robust result, where a value of 1 means that the results can be overturned even with full randomization, so not robust at all. The biggest effects seem to be in open canopy forests, and you'll notice that the Rosenbaum bounds are value is even higher. This value of gamma, and so unlikely that this would be overturned. You know, that we're seeing something unobservable in the background, which could crop up that would be overturning this. And again, though the standard errors are bigger, we see that still easily significant at the 95% level. Higher altitude, we find it a negative effect, and it's the only break, it's the only sub area where we find a negative effect. In hills, we just find no effect at the 95% level. Notice that higher altitude is it's a very low value of that Rosenbaum gamma. So very likely to be overturned. Can't really have much confidence that indeed that's a negative effect. So in sum there, it seems that the community forestry program indeed does increase biodiversity, though we do see some differences across regions, perhaps indicating the need for some region-specific policies. So what about SDG 10 on the effect of the community forestry program on equity and benefit sharing? And here's a photo of Hari Luintel leading one of the focus groups that underpin this work. And this is a paper that came out in Journal of Environment and Development in 2017. So what Hari did really was, created indices, a Likert scale based on these household level responsives. And the first one that I'd like to talk about is the equity index, focusing on ask the households whether they were fair rules in their user group, fair processes, fair practices. Are they able to avoid conflicts, things like that. And then these indices were created using principal component analysis. And what we find is very positive and robust results, robust across types of people. Overall, easily, pretty small standard errors, very positive result of that effect of the community forestry program on that equity index. And you might think that that would be kind of peculiar to maybe richer folks, but it turns out not. That poor Dalits, so with bigger standard errors, also agree that that they're more fair, equitable systems, and indigenous people. Women-headed households getting very borderline there, but still positive effect. So we find effects of the community forestry program on equity, SDG number 10, generally very positive. We don't find a statistically significant effect in the TRI. I didn't mention that directly. But an important caveat here is that the community forest program user groups, they do receive some support from those outside. They're not completely autonomous. And so it's possible that those groups are exerting some influence on those groups that could be helpful there. Though, as has been mentioned this morning, it's really a core part of the community forestry program that there'd be equity focus. Okay. So just very quickly on the management index. So these are pretty standard measures of positive management among community forest collective action. And just very quickly, we find, again, very positive effects, very robust to observed confounders like the equity index, and really just sort of across the board. Basically, you find that community forestry program, communities and forests, they are managed very differently. They are very managed and probably in harmony with what we think of as better collective management, regardless of the type of forest. Thank you. So first question, how are forests assigned to communities in Nepal? This may affect the relative contribution of CS and of NCFs. Quite right. Forests, well, first of all, as was mentioned this morning, there's a law that governs, law of 1993, that governs this. But fundamentally, communities opt into this program. So, and this depends on many things. They need to abide by these rules, but they must think that they're going to get something out of that. And usually, and my experience and my understanding from working with those who know directly more about this, that usually it's because they want the boundaries of their forests, which they're using, they want those boundaries solidified. And so usually that's kind of what they want. And secondly, these are communities that are able to coordinate. These are fundamentally communities that are able to engage in collective action. Okay, Subrendu. Why non-CF are greater than CF plots? Might the community forest allow for better managed but more extraction that lowers the amount of carbon sequestration in these plots while providing greater benefits to community members in these CFs? Totally possible. And yeah, I guess that is possible. The and I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. The number, just to be clear, there's equal number of community forests and non-community forests. Probably the fundamental reason why, if you're referring to carbon sequestered, it's because the hills have much bigger population of community forests than the Tarai. And the Tarai, as you very well know, is it's a much more productive ecosystem. So that's so we adjust for that, of course, and including baseline and DVI, but we just don't find effects of the community forestry program. And we acknowledge that this could be because of sample size issues. We just may not be able to detect the effects. We are able to detect them, of course, with other collective action measures. A cost of gaining carbon through forest management is high. Okay, how high? Well, we're still working on that. And Aaron has worked a lot on this. Aaron Sills has worked a lot on this, as probably others have as well. But here's our take on it. What we did was we used an experimental technique called a choice experiment to elicit trade-offs. And we specifically look at fuel wood collection trade-offs. And so we use this experimental technique, and we think we're able to infer the marginal costs by person across our sample. And what we find is especially that they're especially high in community forestry program, those in community forestry program groups. But we're finding like on the order of $45 to $50 a ton, which pretty high, even higher, and maybe 20% lower for those outside the program. And so, we're really wondering if the transactions costs associated with these groups just don't really lend themselves to supplying carbon, though they supply many, many other ecosystem services.